Hi, and welcome back to Resilience Unravelled. And with me, two stars. Two. Often I get one amazing guest, but today is two. One's not making an entrance yet until a little bit later. But in front of me is Matt Krayton. Matt, how are you doing?
Doing well. How are you? Thanks for having me.
Good. And I'm here. I'm hoping we're going to have a guest join us, Emmy, later on.
I'm hoping so too. She's actually uncharacteristically docile at the moment, so she is sleeping a few feet away. Normally, she's crashing the party already, so we'll see if she gets up and starts wreaking havoc. So hope to have a cameo shortly.
Best sort of business partner, the ones that are sleeping in the corner.
That's it.
Matt, it's a joy to talk to you today. And you better tell us a bit about yourself before we dive into some sort of conversational stuff.
Sure, absolutely. So I have professionally worked in strategic communications for about 14 years now in September. So I started my own strategic communications, public affairs, and political consulting firm in 2011, September of 2011, and have been doing that ever since. That was right out of grad school. That's a whole other story how I ended up doing this, but started the firm, ended up working a lot of political campaigns, and then also working with business leaders, executives on their most pressing strategic communications challenges. And so I had been doing that for, again, about 14 years, and recently launched a new venture, M2 Aspire, where we're working on leadership development and taking a sort of a new approach to leadership and mindset and teams. So that's me in a nutshell. I've basically been doing the same thing for 14 years, and now we're doing something a little bit different but related.
Good. Come on, you tease me in proper PR communications sort of style by saying that's a story I need to get into that talks. So you flagged that, trailed it. So tell me more about that. How did you get into it in the first place then?
I gave you the cliffhanger there.
You
The
didn't you? Come on. I'm just gonna just be such a docile host and just follow your lead.
That's it. That's it. So leaving you with the curiosity gap. That was an interesting story. So I had come out of my undergraduate years. I was planning on becoming a teacher. So for high school teacher in social studies, I went through that whole process, got a master's degree in education, came out of school. There weren't very many jobs at that point. So that was still, we were still shaking off the effects of the Great Recession, 2008 through
Mm.
2011, and where I had gone to school and grew up in New Jersey, we had massive education cuts. So there were very few jobs. And where there were jobs, there were hundreds of applicants usually. So a lot of them experienced teachers are like, oh, I'm probably not getting a job in teaching. I was having some second thoughts about it too. Enjoy the act of teaching, but all the paperwork was a bit much
Yeah.
for me. So I ended up taking the first job that I could, which was fundraising for the university that I'd gone to. And they brought myself in and another gentleman. And our mandate was to raise money from young alumni. And as you can imagine, young alumni in the wake of a financial crisis, having come out of
Mm.
a very expensive private university, most of them with student loans, were not especially happy to open their wallets.
Yeah.
And so our job essentially was to sit on the phone for hours at a time calling through lists of people trying to get them to donate. As you can imagine, too, some of the responses were quite creative in telling me
Yeah.
what to do with myself. Anyway, got used to rejection quite a bit, but 10 months into that, the board of trustees pulled the plug on that position because it just wasn't working. Not a huge surprise there. So laid off, first job out of school, out of grad school. I was, oh man, what am I going to do? So I had this crazy idea that I wanted to work in politics. So in grad school, I had the opportunity to do a little bit of work with Public Opinion Polling Institute, where we did polling and surveys at that university. I was like, oh, this is really interesting. I had done a minor in political science. I'm like, oh, okay, I could see myself doing this. So
Mm.
I decided to give it a shot, try to work on some campaigns and become a consultant, which sounds insane. I had no experience other than that. And so I ended up finding a couple of campaigns that took a chance on me. I told them, wondering what would a campaign trust a young person right out of grad school to do without any experience. I know I'll do social media, right? Because that they're like, you're
Yeah.
young, you can do social media.
Modern
Of
stuff.
course. I'm like, of course I can. I know exactly what I'm doing.
Yeah.
So long story short, I picked up a couple of campaigns and ended up it ended up snowballing, having some good fortune to meet some really great people along the way, and built a business that I'm quite proud of. So that's the origin story, is what I call a typical millennial story, where you thought you were going to do one thing, end up doing something else, and it was all this interesting winding journey, and it's not done yet. looking forward to the next.
But it's also interesting the way it's interesting you talk about the millennial thing, which is a word I can never say. But because the way you describe it, it's really interesting, isn't it? I decided to start a business and then I was really brilliantly successful. Ta-da! And I always think it's amusing when you talk to people of your generation because they forget the bit in the middle, which is all the hard work, the graft, the rejection, the ups and the downs, the financial challenges, the making ends meet, all that sort of stuff. It can't have been a smooth progression. You start with a couple of clients, but that doesn't mean you're going to be successful. It just means that you've got a couple of clients. So how do you leverage those into more work?
I'm glad that you mentioned that because I do notice and that folks do a little bit of blah 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 in the middle, right? Started this business, blah blah blah, and then all of a sudden it was very
Yeah.
successful, and that was hardly the case. And I think for most businesses, that's hardly the case. There are definitely hardships, ups and downs. It's a roller coaster every day. And I remember thinking right after I had started and had gotten the first couple of clients, thinking, okay, if I could just get to a certain amount of revenue each year and a certain number of clients, that I would feel like I was stepping off the roller coaster and I would feel safe and grounded and all of that. And 14 years in, there's still ups and downs. It's still a bit of a roller coaster. So it's I think that's all part of the entrepreneurial journey. But just to give some context, one of the first clients that I had nearly bankrupted me
Wow.
because they just simply did not pay for a bill for a television ad that we were producing. And rather than not pay the film crew, I dipped into my personal savings to pay them what I could and then ate the rest of that loss, which was bad. So I was left in a pretty bad position. And again, thankfully, one of the other campaigns I was able to leverage into more work because we won one of those seats unexpectedly, which and then also to just having met some people. Also, to your point about the sort of messy middle, a lot of there was a fair amount of luck being in the right place at the right time for things. So I ended up meeting a mentor of mine, a person that I worked with as a result of a power outage one night. And he said, the only place that I was going back and forth with this gentleman on social media on direct messages. Yeah, I was trying to get him an absentee ballot or a mail-in ballot for an upcoming election, and the power went out. And he said, "You want to meet me at the local bar? That's the only building that had power in the entire
Mm.
town." I was like, "Oh, sure, whatever." So I went down there, met him. Turns out he had worked in politics for a long time, held some pretty important positions with the United States Senator and was able to network from there. So there was a little bit of good luck, place, right time, whether I guess cooperating or not cooperating, depending on how you look at it. But yeah. So to your point, there was a messy middle. How leveraging the client work that we had done into new client work is still a formula. And I think if people are being honest, it's not always the easiest path. Most of our businesses come from referrals. Once you get the first one, then they might refer you to one other person and then so on and so forth. So almost all of our business over the years has been word of mouth, clients that have been happy, but again, not a linear path. You take a couple steps forward, take a couple steps backwards. Some things work out, budgets don't come through. We're seeing it now as the political environment, policy environment shifts in the United States. So a lot of our clients in certain spaces like clean energy, on the strategic communication side of things, clean energy and other areas like that are taking a hit because all of this funding and has essentially disappeared overnight. There's a lack of certainty in the marketplace. So yeah, I mean, I think running a business is always to some degree, there will always be some amount of stress. Just how you deal with that, I think, is the important part, right? You can let it eat at you. And certainly I've had those challenges over the years, but or you can find ways to cope with it that are a little
Yeah.
more healthy and constructive.
Yeah, interesting. I think you and I have something in our backgrounds which I think has set you up for success. And it took me a long time to recognize it was the thing that really made the difference for me. And it was also being on a phone, canvassing for business, doing telesales, which effectively you did. And I think it's something that's a really valuable lesson about yourself. And actually, it's one of those things that I remember someone saying to me, "You've just been canvassing, looking for business online. How do you do that? It's really hard." And because was doing it when I was young, I said, "Is it?" I didn't realize it was hard until he told me. And it was that thing about you learn to deal with rejection. You learn to deal with, that relentless pick the phone up, say what you have to say. And then sometimes you're surprised when someone says, "Oh, yeah, I would like to talk to you." And then you put the phone down and yeah, they've been shouted or sworn at. And I think that's a vital part of a business apprenticeship that seems to have disappeared these days because of the onset of social media. I see courses about saying how to handle sleazy salespeople because actually all sales are sleazy. And I'm thinking to myself, sales is an honorable profession. It's one of the oldest in a funny sort of way, maybe the third oldest. And what's going through my head is I just wonder if you and I have benefited from that. And I just wonder if we're losing out by not having those sorts of jobs anymore. Basically, you'll have AI doing it all for you soon. But I don't know if that helps our resilience and our ability to become good entrepreneurs and face those sorts of challenges that you see.
I think it absolutely does and did in slightly different ways for me. And if I'm being honest too, I think there is an element of or parts of those lessons that I'm still learning today. So it's interesting, even though that was the first sort of dipping my toe into the waters of professional life, I never liked it. I still
No,
hate it to this day. I hate
yeah,
asking for things. And then
exactly.
so in terms of asking people for things, I think that's something I'm still learning today. Is okay,
Yeah,
it's actually okay to ask people for or contacts for something, for a referral or for a testimonial. So that's an interesting lesson. But in terms of the ability to keep going in difficult situations where it makes sense to keep going, because there are
oh yeah,
situations where it makes sense to cut bait and walk away.
yeah, yeah,
But it does help you push past the hump sometimes when there is one, and it does make sense to do that. So I think early on that was helpful because it does take a little bit of the edge off the fear that you have going into the unknown, right? When you call someone, you don't know how they're going to react. They could react very angrily toward you. But again, I think the thing that got me to where I was hearing people say all sorts of stuff to me, like some very unkind things. Some there were some great conversations too, but a lot of
sure.
things that were a little hard to hear. And it's okay, but that you hang up the phone and the call's over, and that's
Mm,
it. You don't have to carry that with you for the rest of the day. It's
mm,
okay. So great. Did I learn anything from that call? Sure. Maybe I learned that you could react a different way or have led in a different way. But at the end of the day, once that phone is hung up, you don't have to talk to that person again. That's it. It's over. They said no. And I'm still here. I'm still sitting in this chair. I'm breathing. I'm living. So it's all right. So that was, I think, a big lesson. It was very helpful to your point about sales.
yeah. I remember an old sales manager said to me, this is smoke and mirrors stuff. I remember a sales manager said to me, it says it takes 20 calls to get a deal. So you need to get through the first 19 as quickly as possible, whatever the saying to you, so you get to the 20th. And it really is garbage when you hear that. But it does help. This idea that rejection is actually part of the process, like an acting process that you have to go through. I think it's fascinating. And it also makes me think a little bit about modern entrepreneurship, because I think we've gone through that idea now that you have to be massively charismatic and such to be a great entrepreneur. And it's different now, isn't it? You just have to have good process and discipline. You don't necessarily need that magic pixie dust, the alleged magic pixie dust. And I wonder whether that's driven so much of the American culture down thinking they can be entrepreneurs versus being successful entrepreneurs, because a lot of people should really be a sensible cog in a business, and some people should be entrepreneurs. But I do think the differentiation between entrepreneurship and working in organizations is getting blurred because of the way that's working. Maybe that's a bunch of mixed ideas. So I'll let you unpick the gold dust out of that and see what you do from a comms perspective.
Yeah, that's yes, absolutely. So I think there has been this sort of harmful construction of this the idea of entrepreneurship.
Mm,
I'm not sure, and I'd be curious to hear if these are things that you're seeing in the UK and mainland Europe. But in the US, there is very much, especially on social media, this picture of hustle culture, right? Where you have these people who are shooting videos in front of their or whatever a Lamborghini, right? It might not even be their Lamborghini, and they've got the expensive
yeah.
watches on, right? So all these like, little signals of I have success, and then they are telling you you can have success too. Just follow my 10
Mm,
step process or whatever, buy my course or whatever. And some of those courses are helpful, I think, to some extent, but a lot of that is just it's like a course to create courses to create course. It's like this meta sort of loop inception of course that movie
yeah.
Inception. It's is this real or is this
Yeah.
you got to spin the top and figure it out. I think that this picture of entrepreneurship that's been painted in the US is a bit distorted because most entrepreneurship, right? If you look at most successful businesses in the United States, they're not the magic fairy dust,
No.
unicorn tech startups. They're not these sort of solopreneur celebrity business operators or entrepreneurs online personalities. They're family businesses, right? Things that were
Yeah.
or businesses that people say like light manufacturing or plumbing or electricians. So there are all sorts of businesses that are making millions of dollars a year. You just don't see anything about it. And so I think that in those cases, it's just execution. Execution is an important thing for an entrepreneur. Being able to have the idea and then actually do the thing is extraordinarily important. There are differences, and I think that, but that's pretty universal across the board, whether you're talking about the tech unicorn or you're talking about a local plumbing business. So I do think that the picture of entrepreneurship and the idea of what that means to be an entrepreneur is a little bit distorted because it definitely looks different for everyone.
Yeah.
And there is no one thing, but the consistent thread, I think, again, is execution, just putting one foot in front of the other. For the most part, that's what you're doing. And sometimes you have giant
Yeah.
leaps forward after you're putting one foot in front of the other for a long time, but there is no easy button, which I think people would have you believe.
You're saying something really profound there, I think, because when you talk about those courses, what you're actually saying is, and I say this a lot. So in the world of therapy, for example, which I'm associated with, I think you make more money out of training therapists than you actually do being a therapist now. In the UK, certainly. And you'll see it in many of the service industries without that sort of formalized real business operational type thing, the sort of dollars for hours type businesses. And you see this, people in the actual world turning things into training courses. In fact, when you said you're going to go to leadership, I was a bit surprised because I thought the obvious thing you'd be doing is running a training course on how to do PR and comm strategy for organizations. It would make a heck of a lot more sense. But come back to that in a minute if you don't mind. But I think what you said is really important there. And I think it's what you're differentiating for me is the difference between the process of entrepreneurship and the outcomes. And it's the outcomes that people focus on. They don't realize how much work it is. It is tremendously hard work. And that's why we often talk about the passion of entrepreneurship, don't we? Because unless you enjoy what you do, and it can be a bit relentless. But I often find that the people sitting at the top, the speakers, the standing on stages and this and that and the other, and talking about this, that, and the other, always millionaires who've run businesses and retired. And they probably weren't talking about that stuff when they were junior representatives. I can't think of the appropriate car in the US,
Mhm.
BMW 1 Series or something along those lines, schlepping around. I bet they weren't talking about passion and vision. They were just looking at their targets and figuring out what do I need to do next. So there's a sort of myth, isn't there, that needs to be busted here. Because there's a myth about how you make money. And there's a myth on social media, isn't there? I've got a friend of mine who is massively busy. His diary is always full. He's never on social media. He's never on any bit of networking because he's too busy, as he says to me, I'm too busy to be doing that stuff. And I see a direct correlation between the people who are really busy and effective and the amount of interaction they're doing for themselves, the puff pieces for themselves. I'm delighted to announce oh, that old nonsense again. Now, you're going to probably tell me in this a minute when we talk politics and comms that those things are important. But they're not as important as actually going out, finding business, cutting invoices, delivering great work, getting the money in. I think you said that really importantly. People forget that getting the money in is really more important than spending it.
Oh, absolutely. I think it's a balance, right? Finding that balance between doing things that you need to in order to get the attention that you need ultimately so that people will consider hiring you. And again, that could be in a number of ways. It could be on social media, it could be from a referral from a happy client. So there is an element of highlighting your own work that is important. It certainly goes way too far at points though, where you have folks who will stand up on these stages. And one thing that actually drives me insane is not even the retired people who have gone through business and talk about vision and passion and all of that. I think there's some value to that. They've been through
Sure.
it. There are a lot of people who will get up there and say, here's how you build a successful business. And I've been in business forever. And then you're starting to you think, what did they do though? And then you start Googling around, you start searching in their background. Like, what business were you in exactly?
Yeah.
You start to find out a lot of these people never really ran a business. The only business
Nope.
that they've run is a business selling courses about how to run business.
Yeah.
And so it is a funny thing where it's like, what is going on? So to your point, there are a number of ways to be successful. And a lot of there is no easy button. I think that's one thing that I try to emphasize for people. And you see it in politics too, politics, business, for people who are trying to better themselves in their careers. You see this yearning for an easy button. You push the button, and then
Mm.
all of a sudden you're going to do one TikTok, for example, and then all these offers for sponsorship and you're going to start flooding in, or you're going to have opportunities to sell whatever it is you're selling. And the reality is that's not the case for 99.9% of us. Some people hit it lucky. That's true. Some people win the lottery too.
Yeah.
That's the nature of life. So I think it sets up this idea that there is some sort of like easy thing to do. So you can consume your time with all sorts of stuff that has nothing to, and I was certainly guilty of that and still am at points where in earlier in my career, you start spending time on all these other things rather than the
Mm.
core, put one foot in front of the other. Did we get the work done for the client? Was the client work up to par for what we expect? Was the client happy? Is there anything that we can do better? And then you start filling your time with all this other, maybe if I just post a couple of blogs or something,
Yeah.
people are going to come running. And granted, again, that's important. It's just about triaging and finding that balance of how do you get attention appropriately? And then how do you maintain focus on the things that are important while also maintaining a balance in your own life too, which I think you can again occupy a lot of your time
Yeah.
doing stuff that's not helpful, and then also you're squeezing out things that you really do need to do as a professional or as a human being, right? You need to
Mm.
take care of your health. You need to make
Mm.
sure that you're getting enough sleep. You need to spend time with your family and cultivate social relationships. So there are all sorts of things that you actually need to do in order to function optimally at work that people miss out on because they fill their days with a whole bunch of nonsense, or they're trying to, again, start a course about starting a course about starting a business and stuff, that
Mm.
sort of thing.
All right, then let's get on to one of the biggest businesses in America, which is politics, because there's no way of believing it's anything to do with passion or cause or anymore. We just know it's a business opportunity. It's how to get rich. This is the way to how to get rich quick. Or am I being really cynical? I don't know. But one of the things I was going to be intrigued about, it must be quite interesting, Matt, being in the political space and and having that dilemma about who you work for. Do you wear your own politics loudly, or do you actually just say, forget all that, I'm just going to work for either side, whoever's got the cash, I'm happy to help. So how do you make that? And I suppose that goes back to morals, ethics, and values. And I'm not asking you to divulge anything, but I just wondered, is that something you ran over or ran across or something you had to face?
Yeah, I think in the United States, the general rule is that you pick one side and you work on
Right.
that side. Now, for me, it has always been a question of which people with which side aligns with my values personally. And for me, that's always been a pretty clear answer. And now, some firms are more
Now,
out.
at this stage, do we need to part company, or are you going to be on the sides of common sense?
It depends on, yeah. So common sense, in my view, is that what is happening today in America is extraordinarily concerning in many ways in terms of preserving democracy, preserving institutions, things, protections that I think we all thought that we had. So in terms of common sense, yes, I think we should have rule of law. I think we should have a system where votes are actually counted as opposed to people trying to be excluded from the process. Free speech is incredibly important, not in the ways that I think some of the other folks would have complained about for years. Oh, I'm being
Mm.
censored on my own platform. It's no, you own. I won't. I'll get myself in it. It'll get both of us in trouble. But
But you won't.
but people, right? You see a lot of these people who have massive platforms, right? Millions and millions of listeners or
Yeah.
followers on social media, and then you hear them complain about being censored. It's no, what you're talking about is accountability, right? The marketplace, the capitalistic marketplace, just simply doesn't like what you're selling, or some portion of that, right? They don't
Yeah.
like what you're selling, and it is completely within their judgment to decide whether or not they like whoever whatever group of people likes your stuff or doesn't. But you still have millions of listeners. No one's actually shutting you down. So that by free speech, you have like Bruce Springsteen, for example, speaking out against the
Mhm.
administration, then being threatened with investigations. Now that
Yeah.
is a violation of free speech. That is an attempt by the government to have a chilling effect on free speech. So it's that sort of thing to me is concerning. And to your point about values and picking which side to work with, it's I think at some point in American history you probably could have made an argument for. I see things in both parties that,
Yes.
and in fairness, like I think, yeah, I think that's true, right? You go back to Eisenhower, who's a Republican,
Yeah.
building the interstate highway system. He had some concerns about the military industrial complex, which I thought were very reasonable. again, and then you could probably find some Democrats at that point who had similar views, or there was some, but at that point, there was a lot of consensus actually around, or not to diverge too much from the topic, but around our social safety net programs, this sort of New
Mm.
Deal coalition where everyone agreed on a certain set of values and things that we were going to, structures that we were going to have in place
Yeah.
in this country from a social safety net perspective. And that started to erode around Nixon and definitely into Reagan. And then you get into a place where there are very clear, now, I think, clear lines drawn in where your values sit on that spectrum. So for us, it's always been a pretty straightforward thing. And we're going to work with people that we believe in both their approach and their policy and what they're saying from a political perspective. It, and we've also said no to people in the
Mm.
same party, right? Because again, it's not everyone, just because you have a D or an R next to your name means you're a good or bad person. It just,
Yeah.
so we have been fortunate enough to be able to work with people that we align with mostly. You're not going to agree on everything, but generally, it's, are you trying to do good for people? Okay, that's, we're starting there. Do you believe in different sort of policy directions or frameworks? Sure. Okay, then we can work together. I mean, we're not super strict though. We're not very. There are some firms that are very activist in how they look at things. So you have some firms that will work exclusively with what you would think are very progressive candidates, like on the far
Mm.
left of the party, and you'll have people who work with more moderate Democrats. They were all over the spectrum. Again, it's very specific to the candidate, but again, we've had a chance to. So that's how we decide ultimately, is like who to work with and who not to, and then that translates into the business piece of it too. When we're working with executives and organizations and brands, we try to work with organizations that at least have some shared values. Again, you're not going to agree on everything, but can we do some good here? Okay, let's take a look at this and see what we can do.
Yeah. Interesting. It is fascinating looking at the US because what you're looking at is is a country whose resilience has been tested, isn't it? Because what you're seeing is the fabric of the structures and the processes of the organization being, not the organization of the country, be under attack. And
Mhm.
they're under attack from within. And it's interesting, isn't it? You look at some of the analysis done by each side, and the analysis always is right. And what the issue is the solution, isn't it? And I think
Mhm.
people confuse the policy with the actual process of getting things changed. Obama is always held up to be, on the whole, a brilliant president, except he wasn't really, but he was a brilliant speaker and a real mover and orator and such. But he made some catastrophic mistakes, and all presidents do because of the nature of your political system. But we've never seen your system under so much, internal combustion. It was all predicted. We've all read Project 2025 and thought, come on, this is all written down. This is a 900-page document that tells you exactly what they're going to do. And it's no surprise that when they get in, they're doing it. So I think it is quite interesting. And no, I don't know, but I don't know whether your view is that the resilience of your country is such that it's going to hold against the current onslaught. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
I hope so. I hope so. I think if we're thinking about resilience in general across the board, even down to the individual level, we have certainly lost something as a country in terms of how resilient we are as people, how we deal with issues in our lives. So one of the interesting things that we've observed in doing some polling and focus groups over the last probably, let's say 10, 15 years is that people externalize a lot of their personal
Mm,
issues into political opinions.
yeah,
So there's some frustration or resentment in people's personal lives. And some of those things are very valid, right? Like we've had a system that has effectively eroded in many ways a middle class living,
yeah,
manufacturing. There definitely, you could have some arguments about whether a lot of the trade deals like NAFTA were really made a whole lot of sense or not. I think we can, hindsight is 2020. You could look
of
back and
course.
okay, maybe there were some different things that we could do to protect American industry in a lot of these Rust Belt towns. But I think in general, we've come into this sort of tribalism where we tend to externalize a lot of our feelings into our politics rather than building that resiliency to be able to live in this modern world that we have, right? Because at the end of the day, like our nervous systems are still programmed for better or worse to deal with significant threats to our well-being,
Mm,
right? This fight or flight response kicks in a lot of ways. And I think now that we don't have to run away from bears in the wild for the most part, hopefully not anyway, that we that has gotten turned back on other aspects of our lives where we start to perceive other groups that don't quite look like us or maybe sound like us as threats. And then you start to externalize every political, oh, but those people are getting something that I should be getting. So now
Mm,
so there is a lack of resilience, I think, in our society at the even the individual and community level that does not that does not bode well, I think, for a collaborative government where, again, it requires essentially what our system of government, really any system of government, is an agreement by everyone involved that there are
mm,
certain ground rules that you're going to follow.
yeah.
Right? And once there are, you have one powerful party or a person that says, you know what, I don't think I'm going to follow these rules anymore. It does start to rip at the fabric of our system.
I think it's interesting, a messaging thing. I had a guest on who was saying that the key now to be able to manage resilience over the future is this idea of looking forward and managing risk and such. And his sage advice was, we've lived for 80 years in a war world. We're now in a pre-war world. And the sooner we all get to grips with that, the better. And of course, the problem with that sort of statement and the sort of whole point of confirmation bias is that we're now all looking for the signs of war and they're coming. And it's a fascinating, it's going to be the next 10, 20 years going to be a fascinating time for us all because looking at the relentless cycles of history, we're due a bit of argy-bargy. And what's interesting with that is that it puts into context all the sort of problems, the sort of first world problems that we have at the moment, because actually when you get an existential threat, a lot of that goes away. You've got very terribly marginalized and victimized communities in the US. And things like hate speech have disappeared now. No one's interested in hate speech because actually they're worried about actually being treated or being evicted from the country. And some of those nice to haves are going to disappear. And I think what's interesting, I think we're going to have to develop resilience pretty quickly, or you're going to have nations of victims. I think that's really challenging.
It is, yeah, absolutely.
Hopeful thought for this afternoon, isn't it? We've gone a bit dark.
Little bleak. Yeah, we're really laying in here. I think that's right. Because there are people who are actually victims, and then there's victim mentality that takes hold like, among people who actually objectively have a lot of power and a lot of and access to resources and access to platforms who are
Yeah.
for whatever reason feeling aggrieved by what is going on in society. And then you end up again seeing this sort of resentment building. So again, I think that so there are things that we have to do that at a collective and community level and individual level to repair our society. The answers to our biggest issues right now in this country are not entirely political answers, right? It's not just go out and win an election anymore because the margins are so thin, and we have to figure out how to. This is going to sound a little, I don't know, squishy, but we
Go
have to
for it.
figure out how to heal as a country, right? I think that's part of the issue is we have to turn that temperature down. We have to get the boil down to a simmer, down to a still pot. Like we cannot continue down this path where there's so much anger out there.
Yeah. I think it's for me, it's learning, not healing, but I get where you're coming from. Just a thought then. So you've got all this expertise running political campaigns and PR, comms, strategy, all that sort of stuff. And you're going to take all that and just throw it all away, talking about leadership. Goodness sake, Matt, what on earth are you thinking?
That's been a theme of my life. What do you think in starting this firm right out of grad school or what? So I think it's a pattern repeating itself. But I so the idea is we're going to keep the strategic communications firm running while starting this second leadership venture. And what we've seen over the years is a an overlap in those two areas, and it took us a while to conceptualize what that might look like as a
Mm,
separate service offering. But I do think that in some ways there is some overlap. So a lot of leadership does hinge on being able to persuasively communicate your vision to your audience, whether that's an internal audience, an external audience, or even articulate it to yourself, your board, whoever you're communicating with in that time. So there is that piece, right? And positioning yourself as maybe a thought leader in a space. But then there's also the mindset piece. And this is an interesting thing that we have realized over the years is that when we're working with politicians, and I think it's interesting. So if you zoom out, a lot of people in the United States, right, you put people on a bit of a pedestal, right? You're a member of Congress or you're a leader or you're someone that's very visible in the public eye. And you make these assumptions about their ability to make decisions, to be decisive, to say the right words, do the right things. And at the end of the day, they're all human beings too, right? Just executives of large companies. And what you don't see is the process behind the scenes for a lot of people in getting to a place where you can make a decision, or you can direct your team to do something in particular, or you can communicate the things that you need to communicate. So oftentimes what we found ourselves doing is doing a lot of that mindset work. How can we get these people into the right headspace to do something? Because I think that we've seen this instinct over the years to try to split the baby all the time and try to make everybody happy. And that's just not the reality.
Yeah.
You're not going to make everyone happy, but you can, I think, do a fairly good job of showing people what your process is so they understand how you got to a decision, why you got to a decision, but they don't have to necessarily be happy with the outcome. Because when you try to make everyone happy, then and no one ends up being happy. So we started to see a lot of those issues, and then bringing in different tools to help under different names, or in a sneaky way. But for example, meditation, breathing techniques, breath work, like all of those things have been incredibly useful. Imagine yourself walking out on a debate stage, right? The bright lights, there's a crowd there, your opponent's staring you down from the other podium. Your heart's going to be racing more likely than not a little bit. Some people get more used to that, but the natural response again is that fight or flight to kick in. So finding ways to stay present, grounded, to breathe through that, to calm that nervous system down a little bit so that you can deliver a performance that's not shaky, I think is something that we've done over the years. Or again, getting people out of an aggressive or angry headspace before coming into difficult conversations. Because I think that's another thing we see with leaders is that when you need to hear feedback about yourself, oftentimes you get pretty defensive, or you can get defensive about things. That doesn't really help you though, because you're not listening to what the person is saying. You're just angry that they're challenging you on something. So helping leaders take feedback and give feedback a little bit more effectively, I think, are things that we have done all of these years. We just haven't packaged as a service. And my partner Molly and I, her name is Molly McGarrick. She actually served as a cabinet secretary, which is in Delaware governor's office, running the Department of Health and Human Services. So they're essentially the heads of these massive multi-billion-dollar departments, thousands of employees. So she's fantastic. And again, similar backgrounds in politics and government between the two of us. And when we were starting this, we just thought, yeah, I think it's time to actually have a lot more of these conversations out loud, because I think, again, that messy middle is something that we don't talk about enough, but we really do need to talk about, because emerging leaders, people who are trying to step into leadership positions, or people who are already in leadership positions, they look to the wrong examples. I think when you think leader, right, and not you and I, but I think generally if you ask the public, okay, what do you think about a leader? Typically you're going to get a somewhat of a cross section of opinions, but a lot of people are going to say it's the loudest, most opinionated, most confident person at the front of the room. That's how we end up in some of these political situations. I can fix
In the States,
in
in
this.
the United States, that's true, but not everywhere.
No, certainly not, right? So I think it is very culturally dependent thing. We are not a collectivist society, right? But we do look to leaders to tell us essentially what to do or how to fix our lives or whatever. So I think you tend to have this picture of someone, or the archetype of the loud, confident person at the front of the room. That's not actually leadership. That's one element maybe of it, being a decent communicator. But so I think our thesis was, I think it's time to start having a lot of these conversations out loud, because I think there are a lot of leaders who would like to engage in more mindset work, and they just don't know how to start. So when you start having these conversations and there's another way in, I think people open up to it. So we figured, well, why not have these conversations out loud and start drawing attention to it?
On that, as you said earlier, the way to get hold of you in the new leadership gig is M2, number two, aspire.com. And I can't pronounce you're classically in a communications firm. No one can pronounce the name. So it's public. Oh, you better say it. I can't say it.
It's politics. It's funny. I've wrestled with,
Publitics.
yeah,
That's it. Yeah.
for a
Yeah.
while. Politics or Publitics, some people say. So it's
Not Publix, the supermarket.
no
No.
relation. Yeah, we do not sell groceries.
The old thing about cobbler's children. So there you go. It's been a joy today. I've just looked up and seen the time, and I need to be a bit more respectful of your time. So I think we probably need to call it a day. It's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for coming. Matt's new endeavor will be linked to in our podcast and our website and on YouTube. So, Matt, it's been a joy. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you.